Hey everybody, I'm Christy and welcome to our series, Compassion Changes Everything. We're on our 5th week. Natural disasters are something that we all deal with. We know that every year there are going to be people who are affected by hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, droughts, the list goes on. It can be devastating, but they're really real storms. And how we respond to those who are going through those storms is extremely important in how we live out a compassionate life. You might be thinking, I can't do anything to help someone in that situation, but we all face storms in our personal lives. We go through times of sadness and grief, anxiety, loneliness, the list goes on. We all face these storms in our life. There's no getting out of that. I wish I could give you all a lesson on how to avoid these storms entirely, but it's just not realistic. And on top of that, storms are what help us grow. If we go through life without facing struggles or running into problems, we don't develop the skills or the faith that we need to help others and help ourselves. How many of you get frustrated when things aren't going your way? Believe me, I've been there. But the path that we have planned for ourselves will almost never go exactly the way that we hope. The unexpected kind of trouble has a way of sneaking up on us at the worst possible moments. And when we're struggling to deal with interruptions or pauses in our plans, it can be easy to let anger or sadness build up. Storms are the time when most of us would act in anger or frustration. Now, doing those things like taking breaks when things go wrong or taking a break to collect yourself and your thoughts, those will help you remain calm and loving even in hard times. Even if this pushes back on your plan or forces you to reevaluate your path or it catches you by surprise. The most important thing we can do in our storms is respond with compassion, which we can't do in the heat of a problem's frustration. So today, I want you to remember this one thing. We respond to storms with compassion. And why do you think that that's so important? Showing compassion is so simple, yet makes so much of an impact. And we're told to show compassion just like our memory verse says. You must be compassionate just as your Father is compassionate, Luke 6:36. Now there are so many easy ways to show compassion throughout our days, like complimenting someone's clothes or offering to help carry heavy groceries, sitting next to someone who is alone at lunch, teaching a new hire how to do something at work, the list goes on. When everything's going perfectly in our plans, it's easy to show kindness to everybody. And why wouldn't you be compassionate while you're in a good mood or having a good day? It's the most convenient time to give extra support, love, or time to someone who needs it because we have the extra support, love, or time to give. When we're struggling though, why would we want to give our time to help someone else when we need all of our free time that we can spare? When we use our time and resources to help others, they remember. We as humans are community-based, and when we go out of our way to do favors for others, they tend to do the same for us. This includes when we're facing our own storms. If someone asks for help, even if you're dealing with your own hardships, the godly thing to do would be to assist them in whichever way we can. Everyone faces storms, and it's important to remember that whenever we're facing our own, we're gonna go through things. And there's almost never a time when everything is going perfectly. Even if a lot is going well, there's normally something in the back of our mind that's causing us stress or worry. You never know how big the thing that someone else is dealing with is. We respond to storms with compassion. Say that with me. We respond to storms with compassion. So how did Jesus respond to storms? Well, let's dive into it. Number 1, identify the storms. Jesus responded to an actual storm in the Bible. Now, storms is a reference to the other struggles that we face on a daily basis that we need to identify, and that takes more than looking at the weather. Now, sometimes real storms are really dangerous, and when Jesus walked on the earth, they were dangerous, especially for sailors. Jesus and his disciples had been traveling and preaching to huge crowds. They were ready to head home to get some much needed rest. The disciples got in a boat to get home faster because a storm was approaching. So let's read in Matthew 14. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." A few things in this moment would absolutely freak me out. Number 1, the obvious storm. Drowning does not sound like fun. Number 2, a man is literally walking towards me on water. It's not possible, right? And number 3, I can hear this man speaking to me over the storm. These men had every reason to be afraid. But Jesus speaks and tells them, "Don't be afraid. Now, we all deal with storms, and it starts with us identifying the storm before we can deal with it. In this instance, it's a literal storm, which is pretty easy to identify. But in our lives, and especially in the lives of others, it's difficult to know what storms we're going through. Your friend may be struggling with loneliness, and that's not something that's easy to identify. So you have to respond to others with compassion and show them that you're a safe place. Just like Jesus reaches out to the men and tells them to not be afraid. Remember, we respond to storms with compassion. Say it with me. We respond to storms with compassion. Number 2, step into the storm. The next thing we have to do when it comes to helping others through their storms is stepping out into the storm with them. It does us and others no good to just identify the storm and then do nothing. We can't be a friend that's like, I know that so-and-so is dealing with grief because their grandparent died, and then we just not offer support. We have to be willing to step into the storm with them and walk alongside them as they deal with their storm. That's an act of compassion. Peter wanted to trust in God just as much as Jesus did. He wanted to ignore the storm around him and focus only on Jesus. He wanted to step into the wind and rain even when he was feeling afraid. So let's find out what happens when we keep our eyes on Jesus during storms and when we take our eyes off of him. Then Peter called to him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water. Yes, come, Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. When we step into the storm with others, it requires a lot of faith. And that's what Peter shows us. He takes a huge leap of faith and walks out on the water towards Jesus. Now again, if I were the other disciples, I'm absolutely terrified. I have now witnessed my friends step out onto the water and they're standing. But his faith was so pure in that moment. We have to be willing to step out of our comfort zones, our boats, and walk with those who are going through storms in their lives. We have to extend compassion to them. And if we're the one going through the storms, we need to remember that Jesus is walking with us in that storm. We respond to storms with compassion. Now, Peter ends up taking his eyes off of Jesus and focuses on the storm around him. That's when he begins to feel the weight and the terror of the storm. He begins to sink. When we focus on the storms in our lives, we sink. The storms become bigger and they're harder to deal with. We have to continue to look to Jesus. When we see our friends and family sinking into their storms, we have to help point them to Jesus as well. So number 3, extend a helping hand. Jesus will always be there to hold our hands when we have faith in him. But the storms around us can still look scary, even if Jesus is protecting us from them. When we keep our eyes on him, we can let him protect us and guide us. When we look at the storm, we stress ourselves out for no reason. And when we see others who are struggling with their storms, we can help them focus back on Jesus by showing them compassion. Now let's read what Jesus does. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. You really are the Son of God, they exclaimed. We can't change the direction of storms. We can't outrun them, we can't calm the wind, or we can't dry up the rain. Some things are beyond our control. So we might as well remain calm, respond with kindness and love, even during times of stress. We need to leave it all in Jesus' hands. We should offer immediate aid to those who are dealing with storms. We shouldn't hesitate or question if we should help. We need to extend our hand and we need to help. That's how we show compassion in the midst of storms. I want to look at Convoy of Hope, an organization who helps people throughout the world, and how they help others through storms. When natural disasters strike all around the world, they're there. They don't hesitate to help the communities that are suffering through storms. They get their teams and they get on the ground as soon as they can. Actually, they're usually one of the first groups that arrive to help provide aid to those who are suffering. Over the years, I've seen Convoy help communities after hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, tornadoes. I've even seen them helping when groups of people are being persecuted in other countries. They don't hesitate to provide compassion in the midst of the storm. They make sure that hurting people receive the help and the strength that they need to get back on their feet. Convoy is committed to helping as much as possible for as long as possible. And we need to look to them as an example of how we should live our lives. There are people around us who are going through storms. They may not need water or shelter, but they may need love and someone to listen to them. You can be that. Show them the love of Jesus. We respond to storms with compassion. Now, have you ever reacted to a storm out of anger or frustration? I'm sure we all have at one point or another, but it never really helps. Let me ask you this. Have you ever gotten mad at an inanimate object because it wasn't doing what you wanted? It sounds silly, but that happens so often. Does it help? No. The door doesn't feel bad that it started to close even though you piled things in front of it to try and get it to stay open. These things always make us feel so silly looking back at it, even knowing how frustrated you might have been in the moment. Have you ever gotten mad or frustrated at a person, even though it wasn't their fault, just because they were the best option you had to place the blame? How did you feel about that after the frustration passed? Reacting negatively to storms at the moment never ends well. In the best case scenario, we feel a little silly and move on. In the worst case scenario, we have someone who we seriously owe an apology to, and if they were facing their own storm or maybe the same one, we just placed more stress or anxiety on them when they likely didn't deserve it. Everybody deserves compassion, even in hard times. Remember, we respond to storms with compassion. I want you to say that with me. We respond to storms with compassion. I want you to think about a storm that you might not have handled properly. It's okay if it was a really long time ago or if it happened super recently. I want you to share this with the person sitting next to you and then come up with one way you could have had compassion in that instance. And then afterwards, discuss how this would have changed the situation. What are some of the hardest moments in our lives to have compassion? Whether we're facing a fear of ours or drama between family and friends, a big life change, or even those small inconveniences that seem to catch us at the worst possible moments. We have to work to have a more positive state of mind during all of those so that compassion can always be the first reaction we have, both towards ourselves and towards others. And when we see others that are going through storms, we can act out of love and compassion. We can love and support them so they don't sink back into the waters. This week, I want you to show compassion to one person dealing with their own storm. Remember, storms can be really big or really small, so there's plenty of ways that you can help. Write down how you can help, bring it back, and share with your class next week. Let's start spreading compassion even through the wind and the rain. Let's pray. Dear God, I thank you so much that you give us the ability to respond to our storms and to other storms with compassion. Just help us be your hands and feet so that we can spread your love and your hope to those who need it. And if you haven't made Jesus the leader of your life, you can do that with me right now. Just pray. Dear God, I recognize I've sinned, I've done wrong. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to experience your peace, your love, and your compassion for the first time in my life. Come into my heart and change me so then I can help others receive your compassion as well. Amen. Remember, you have the ability to respond to storms in your life and in other lives with compassion.